Hey everybody. So, free agency is pretty much done. The only thing that you would probably see now is maybe a depth signing or PTOs. Teams have pretty much spent their money, and whatever they're going to spend, they've spent it. So I wanted to look at how much teams are spending as far as close to the salary cap, and what teams are spending what. So I went to Cap Friendly because that is the best place to find anything NHL salary-wise, salary cap, stuff like that. Cap Friendly is the place to go. And what I found is that most teams are spending, most of their money. A lot of teams are spending close to the cap, not giving themselves a ton of space. So I looked into, just looked at a few things here. 9 teams have less than $3 million in cap space right now. So that's a good number of teams. A little less than a third of the league have less than $3 million to play with. So, they're spending right up to the cap. 11 teams have less than $5 million. So, 2 more teams are between that 3 and 5 range. And so with 11, you have, right about a little over a third of the league has less than $5 million to play with. So these teams are spending right up to the cap. Your top five spenders right now are St. Louis, Pittsburgh, Washington, Minnesota, and Florida. All those teams are expected to be competing for playoff spots this year. So, it's good teams that are spending this money. If you're a rebuilding team, why would you spend, right up to the salary cap? You're better off giving yourself some cap space. And when you look at teams like the New York Rangers or the Ottawa Senators, Vancouver, Arizona, teams like that, they've got more cap space than most other teams in the league. They're all pretty much all right around the $10 million in cap space range. As far as teams that are spending a lot of money, and have less than $5 million in cap space, really the only bad team in that group, the only team in that group that I look at and go, they're not going to make the playoffs this year, are the Detroit Red Wings. And they only have $2.8 million in space. So Detroit is spending very close to the cap. They're one of these 9 teams with less than $3 million in space, yet they're not very good and haven't been for the last couple of years. So I don't know why Detroit spends so much money. I think they need to just accept the fact that they need a rebuild, but they obviously have a lot of big contracts for much older veteran players that are still on the books there, and they're re-signing guys like Mike Green, signing Trevor Daley. They still have Nick Kronwall and Jonathan Erickson. Justin Abdelkader's contract is just absolutely atrocious. Detroit has spent a lot of money very foolishly, and it is not helping them right now. They've tried to live off the success of the past, and that success has completely run out at this point. And they need to rebuild, but they don't seem to understand that. As far as teams that aren't spending a lot of money, teams with a lot of cap space left that are good teams and teams that you would expect to be in the playoffs. Winnipeg and Philadelphia both have $10.2 million in cap space left. They're not spending a ton of money, and they're still quality teams and, expected to be playoff teams this year. Colorado was a playoff team last year, even though it was very unexpected. They have $12 million in cap space, so they're not spending that much. The only team that has spent less than $60 million out of the 78 plus that is allowed, the cap ceiling is $78.8 million, I believe. The only team that has not spent $60 million is the New Jersey Devils. They have only spent 59 point something million, and it's interesting to see what they're doing, because they had a ton of money to work with in free agency, and they really didn't add anybody. They were a playoff team last year, barely, and we'll have to see how this year goes for them. I am really surprised that they didn't, add some big piece into that roster to build off of last year, and make them even better, and make them, more of a threat this year, and not a borderline playoff team, but make them a pretty secure playoff team, and maybe someone who could make a run. They didn't do that, so it's going to be interesting to see what the Devils look like this year. You look at all these teams that are spending pretty close to the cap. You have a third of the league with less than $5 million in cap space, and there is your answer right there on why there's a lot less trading in the NHL nowadays than there were in the old days before the salary cap. Before the salary cap, you basically spent what the owner would allow you to spend. So if you were a team, let's say you were, a playoff team, but you weren't a contender, like you were a team that was going to make the playoffs, but you didn't have the team to go, Stanley Cup. If you wanted, there was no salary cap. You could trade a bunch of your draft picks away, bring in, try and stack your team, bring in some, high quality players, spend a ton of money for that season, and then go all in on a Stanley Cup. You can't do that anymore. You have to make the money work, and teams have a lot harder time making the money work with a salary cap now, because they cannot go over that cap. I mean, it's not exactly you can't ever go over the cap. Teams do go over the cap sometimes. Basically, what happens is if at any point during the season you're spending more than the cap ceiling allows, it gets deducted from your salary cap for the next year. So I think teams have done that over the past few years. I believe Pittsburgh's done that. Chicago's done that. Those high-end contending teams that are, almost, at the time were Stanley Cup favorites, they've gone over the cap a little bit to, make that run for the Stanley Cup, and then it gets deducted off of their salary cap for the next season. But, it's hard to make trades when you only have less than $3 million to play with, and that's 9 teams right now, and that's mostly teams that would be teams making trades at the trade deadline to add to their team and make a deep playoff run. If you're spending that close to the cap, you're probably a playoff team, unless you're the Detroit Red Wings. You're probably going for a Stanley Cup. You look at the top spending teams, St. Louis, Pittsburgh's always in the cup hunt. Washington won the cup last year. Florida's a much improved team that's expected to make the playoffs this year. Minnesota is looking to make a deep playoff run for the first time in a very long time. These are teams that are going to want to add pieces at the trade deadline to make those deep runs. They don't have money to work with. So that's why there's a lot less trading nowadays than there were, 15, 20 years ago, because it's really hard to make the money work. So basically, a lot of teams are spending very close to the cap. There aren't many teams with 10 or more $1 million in cap space. A majority of the league has single-digit million in cap space. So that means teams are spending the money that they're given, and generally the teams spending the most money are good teams who are playoff teams in Stanley Cup contenders, unless you're the Detroit Red Wings. And there are some teams that are considered, quality, good teams, playoff teams, maybe even teams that could be a contender. You look at Winnipeg last year. They went to the conference final. They're certainly a contender. They have over $10 million in cap space. So there are those kind of diamond in the rough teams that don't spend that much, but do do have good rosters, but generally, if to put a Stanley Cup level roster together, you need to spend close to the salary cap, and a lot of teams do. So basically, right now, you're going to see depth signings for like $1 million or less, or PTOs, and then if that PTO turns into an actual contract, it will be less than $1 million. You're not going to have any more big signings, I don't think. And a lot of teams don't have money to work with to make any more big signings, so even if there were people out on the market, it'd be hard to make that money work. So teams are spending to the cap, and that's good to see. That means that a lot of these teams think that they can, go deep into the playoffs this year, and they're going to spend money to put the best possible team on the ice, and that is what everyone wants. That's what, if you have a contending team, that's what your fans want. That's what the league wants. It's what the players want. If you have a chance to make a run and go deep into the playoffs, you're going to do it, and you want to put the best team on the ice as possible. If you're a rebuilding team who knows they're not going to be in the playoffs this year, maybe it's better off to spend less money, give yourself cap space for the future, take those high draft picks and turn them into really, really good players down the road. Detroit doesn't seem to understand that. But anyway, that's where we're at salary cap wise. Teams have pretty much spent their money at this point. So like, comment, share, subscribe, follow on social media, check out offthewallhockey.com. All those links in the description below. Keep spreading the word about this channel. Let's keep this thing growing. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll talk to you guys soon.